Well, about a third of this little congregation was packed into Galloway Station last night to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And I suppose the fact that there will not be a YouTube video of that event is one of the things that we can be thankful for in our prayers of thanksgiving later. This social gathering was organized by our own June Hertenstein, who's the only member of our church whose accent might pass for Irish, but June is no more Irish than St. Patrick was. June is Scottish, and that is a distinction oftentimes lost on this side of the pond, but never forgotten in Britain. Perhaps the more alarming thing, though, about that I just said is not that June is not Irish, but that St. Patrick is not Irish. The truth is that Patrick was born in Wales, and in the 4th century, he was captured by a group of marauding Irishmen who came and took treasure and slaves from the coast of England, and he was kept in slavery in Ireland for 6 or 7 years before he was able to escape and return to his family. Much later, he returned to Ireland as a Christian missionary. Now, it's also alarming to many traditionalists to learn that Patrick, although declared to be a saint, was also not Catholic. He lived before there was a Roman Catholic Church, and March 17th was not his birthday. We don't know when his birthday was. It just happens to be the day that we think he died on. Not a terribly happy holiday then, but the mythical record is that Patrick drove all the snakes from the Emerald Island, which would be a noteworthy thing had there ever been snakes in Ireland. You could say that I drove all the wild tigers out of Springfield, but I'm not going to put that on our stationery because it would be somewhat disingenuous of me to make that claim. As much as some of this factual information might rile an Irishman in the United States, it would not rise to being worth a good fistfight, even in a pub in Dublin, because in Ireland they generally call St. Patrick's Day March 17th. It's a lot more important to second and third generation immigrant families who need a good excuse to drink green beer, but self-respecting patrons in an Irish pub would never be caught drinking green beer. Mark Twain said that a lie told and stuck to is as good as the truth. In many ways, so far as religious traditions go, a lie told and stuck to long enough becomes the truth. Certain biblical myths or certain interpretations of biblical myths become so situated in our minds that they become so true that no one is allowed to speak and sometimes not allowed even to think otherwise, which is generally why most of you ended up here, that you started thinking in ways that you were not allowed to think in traditional churches. We have before us today one of the most familiar passages of Scripture in the whole of the Bible. So familiar that if you see a banner unfurled at a football game that says John 3:16, you know immediately not only exactly what it means, but that you want to be sure that you get seated somewhere else. Now, I've been grading midterm papers all week this week for my students at Drury, so forgive me for putting it just this way, but any C grade student could hear these 7 verses that Russ read for us today and would be able to tell you that it was the "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son" text. A B student would have at least noticed that reference that John makes to Jesus being like the serpent that Moses raised up in the wilderness. You know, everybody doesn't catch that, but a good solid B grade student would have noticed that image being mentioned in the text. A solid B grade New Testament student would at least be aware of that reference in Numbers chapter 21 when the people of Israel had escaped from Egypt, but they started grumbling about how bad the food was. And verse 6 of Numbers 21 says that God, not much caring for food critics, sent poisonous snakes into their encampment to bite them, and many of them died of snake bites. Now, I suppose for our more literalist and fundamentalist friends and viewers, we should say, God loved them so much that he sent poisonous snakes into their camp to bite them and kill them. That way they learned to appreciate God's cooking. So the story goes, rather than command the snakes to go away, like St. Patrick would have done, surely, God tells Moses to make a snake out of bronze, put it on a pole, and set the pole in the midst of the camp. And when anyone is bitten by a poisonous snake, they look up at the bronze snake on the stick, and they're cured. Now, there are several reasons why that narrative should seem a little bit fishy to you, not the least of which, the second of the 10 Commandments is, thou shalt make not a graven image of anything on the earth or in heaven above. So as soon as Moses comes down off the mountain with God saying, don't ever make a graven image, a few chapters later, God is telling Moses, make a graven image of a snake and put it on a pole. There could be something wrong with the editing here. But a really good student, an A-grade student, would dig a little deeper and find that there is a text in 2 Kings in which Hezekiah, who was a king in Israel, was trying to restore true worship of Yahweh, trying to get away from all of the idolatrous practices that had crept into the people and restore Israel to being a truly monotheistic faith and nation. So in Hezekiah's time, there is a bronze snake on a stick in the courtyard of the temple. And so the story they create, the priestly account creates to justify that snake in the courtyard, is that Moses did it. Now, folks, Moses didn't do it. The historical reality is that was one of the gods of that Canaanite area, and they had appropriated so much idolatry that there was even an idol in the courtyard of the temple of Yahweh, and people came into the courtyard and made offerings to this bronze snake. So Hezekiah throws it out. The embarrassing truth of this matter is just that, Hezekiah was the new sheriff in town, and so he was going to try to get rid of all of the idolatry. But years later, the priestly account wanted to clean it up a little bit, and so they made up this whole thing about Moses doing this in the wilderness. But that's not what happened. Again, as Mark Twain says, a lie told and stuck to is as good as the truth. And it would have remained as one of those kind of untidy little bits of narrative in the Old Testament, and you never would have noticed it. We would not be having this conversation about it, except for the fact that John, the gospel writer, picked it up as a metaphor to explain to us why Jesus got killed. You see, in spite of what you were told in Sunday school when you were growing up, there's not just one explanation for the death of Jesus. Because there was no one in pre-Christian Judaism that was expecting God to send a Messiah to die for our sins. That was never a part of their conversation. Some were certainly hoping for a Jewish king to come who would be a successful military leader who could save them from the Roman occupation. But any talk about a Messiah among the Jews never included a cross, did not include death. So the gospel writers had to explain why we're still interested in Jesus, even though he got killed, probably in his first year of preaching. For most of the followers of Jesus, his cruel execution would have been the logical end of the movement. Just like when John the Baptist was beheaded. There was a group of disciples that continued to meet in John the Baptist's name for a while, but the fact that he got his head cut off by King Herod kind of took the wind out of their sails, and that movement just eventually disappeared. For the early New Testament writers, the execution of Jesus was a problem to be explained to their readers, and they tried lots of different ways to explain it. They compared him to a lamb that was sacrificed. Some of their explanations made more sense than others. In some ways, I believe, the more poetic explanations make more sense than the concrete doctrinal explanations. Because here in the midst of this beautiful and very memorable text in the beginning of John, John compares Jesus to that bronze snake, that Jesus up on the cross is like this bronze snake that Moses had allegedly put on a pole. Now, the story about Moses putting a bronze snake on the pole that you could look at and be cured of a poisonous snake bite obviously is not literally or historically true, but as a metaphor, that's a powerful idea. It is a myth used to hide an embarrassing fact that the Jews were keeping an idol in the temple courtyard for a couple of hundred years. But in John's hands, the myth becomes a poetic metaphor for the sacrifice that Jesus made. The Psalms often speak of their Messiah being high and lifted up. And by that they mean the king is going to go up several stairs to sit on a throne that is positioned high above the heads of the people. Their king is high and lifted up. But the paradox for Christians is that when Jesus was lifted up, he was just lifted up about 3 feet off the ground and nailed to a cross. Now, I don't want to go all Mel Gibson on you this morning, but what do you think John means when he says that looking up at that tortured, broken, executed body of Jesus on the cross, that looking at that will heal you? What could he possibly mean by that? They were looking for a king, a Messiah, who would be a great and successful military leader who would both protect them and punish all of their enemies. And what they got was not what they wanted. They got a Messiah on a stick, Christ on a cross. And that looks like failure. And if that's the end of the story, then you just go back to looking for someone to sit on a throne. Now, I know I shouldn't tell you exactly what John meant by using this metaphor, but if you'll indulge me just a moment to return to my previous story about St. Patrick. The part of the story about Patrick that is actually historically true is that he really was captured as a child from his home and taken to be a slave in Ireland. And after he managed to escape from that household, he made his way back to his family in Britain. And there his faith grew. He became a pastor, a priest. And he made the decision to go back to the people who had enslaved him to share with them his faith. He went back to the people who had ruined his life, who took his childhood from him, who took his innocence from him. He went back to those people to try to share the good news with them. And then ultimately to protect the early Christians in Ireland from what was left of the Roman army and their persecution of the Christians. He even is said to have taken money to go to the man who had owned him as a slave and to reimburse him for the loss of the slave. There was a redemption price to be paid for a slave. The tradition says that he even took money to that man. Now, what would make a man do that? What would make a man forgive that much? What could lead a man to set aside his own pain, the natural desire for revenge, and find himself able to sacrifice his life in compassion for people who do not deserve it at all? And if you can look up to a man like that, if you can look up to him, and if you can emulate that character, that willingness to be sacrificed in service of the undeserving particularly, even your own enemies, then I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you could look up to Christ on the cross and be healed.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.